The Gulag Archipelago, 1918 to 1956, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's grand masterwork, is an extensive work with testimonies of approximately 200 survivors, combined with the author's own 11 years in Soviet labor camps and exile. More than a political critique, the book is described as an experiment in literary investigation, focused primarily on fundamental moral matters. Solzhenitsyn conveys that the horrors documented, the devastation of millions, were not mistakes or the result of a cult of personality, but a direct causal consequence of the philosophy driving the communist system, specifically its utopian egalitarian doctrines which led to class hatred and mass destruction. The central moral truth articulated is that the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Part 1. The prison industry. This part details the process of initial capture, interrogation, and sentencing, establishing the physical and psychological mechanisms of the Soviet sewage disposal system. Chapter 1. Arrest. Solzhenitsyn conveys that arrest is a deeply shattering moment, an unassimilable spiritual earthquake that transforms the individual's universe. The typical response is bewilderment. Me? What for? The author argues that citizens' universal innocence also gave rise to the universal failure to act, meaning that resistance should have begun at the moment of arrest itself, but fear and disbelief prevented it. His own arrest came due to correspondence with a school friend. Chapter 2. The history of our sewage disposal system. This traces the continuous influx of victims into the prison system from 1918 onward. It highlights that the enormous number of arrests came in waves, noting, for example, the vast, non-recurring, multi-million wave of dispossessed kulaks, 1929 to 1930, termed an ethnic catastrophe, that bypassed prisons and went directly to camps. The legal basis for this mass repression was the all-encompassing Article 58 of the Criminal Code, which could punish virtually any thought or action. Chapter 3. The interrogation. The author reveals that in the Soviet system, the interrogation time was used not to unravel a crime, but to exhaust, wear down, weaken, and render helpless the defendant. Solzhenitsyn lists numerous methods of physical and psychological torture, including squeezing skulls in iron rings, denying sleep for days, and the bed-bug-infested box. He notes the hypocrisy of prosecutor Vyshinsky's teaching that conviction required only relative, not absolute, truth, based on the interrogator's party sensitivity. The accused was denied access to the Criminal Code UK and the Code of Criminal Procedure UPK. The only successful defense, he concludes, is to internally accept one's death from the moment of arrest, freeing the spirit. Chapter 4. The Blue Caps. This examines the perpetrators, the security officers or Blue Caps, stating that they understood the cases were fabricated but continued their work out of a greed for power and greed for gain. Ideology is described as the justification that allowed mass evildoing, permitting the perpetrators to cross the threshold of evildoing while their eyes remain dry and clear. The chapter famously insists that the dividing line between good and evil runs not through political entities or classes, but right through the heart of every human being. Chapter 5. First cell, first love. The first cell a prisoner enters is cherished like a first love because it ends the isolation and shock of arrest, allowing the soul to heal among comrades. The author describes his innate spiritual sensor relay, which helped him distinguish sincere individuals from planted informers, stool pigeons. It is here he met Vastenko, who urged him to question everything and stated, "To stand up for the truth is nothing. For truth you have to sit in jail." Chapter 6. That Spring. Set in 1945. This chapter focuses on the millions of returning Soviet POWs who were universally labeled traitors of the motherland and arrested. Solzhenitsyn argues the motherland betrayed them thrice: by losing the war and allowing their capture, by abandoning them in captivity, and then by luring them home only to snare them. It also addresses the Vlasov men, who were unique in history for taking up arms against their fatherland, which the author suggests was due to social causes related to deep neglect. Chapter 7. In the engine room, this covers the sentencing, which was performed by the OSO Special Board, an extralegal hamburger machine that convicted people based on non-standard, easily remembered letter articles bypassing the complex criminal code. Sentencing was often mandated by governmental directives. Chapter 8, 9, 10. The law as a child. The law becomes man. The law matures. These chapters trace the legal system's development, beginning with early, indiscriminate public trials, 1918 to 1920, moving to the era when the scope of the criminal code was expanded early 1920s, and culminating in the show trials of the late 1920s and 1930s, where prominent figures confessed to absurd crimes, exposing their deep moral weakness to the state. Chapter 11. The supreme measure. This reviews the use of capital punishment, noting that Stalin expanded the use of the beheading blade well beyond any historical precedent. Chapter 12. Cherzak prison confinement. This chapter explores the philosophical purpose of confinement. It describes the extreme solitude and psychological pressure in the new type prison. It tells the story of astronomer Nikolai Kozyrev, who survived isolation by achieving a spiritual and intellectual victory through deep thought on the eternal, infinite order of the universe. Part 2. Perpetual motion. This part focuses on the continuous movement and transfer of prisoners between the islands of the archipelago camps and prisons. Chapter 1. The ships of the archipelago. Solzhenitsyn describes the invisible mass transport of prisoners, slaves of archipelago in Black Marias, Stolypin cars, and Zak cars. These journeys were characterized by horrific overcrowding and intentional cruelty, such as feeding prisoners salty herring but withholding water. He offers spiritual advice: own nothing, for property will be stolen. Instead, cultivate one's inner knowledge and memory. Chapter 2. The ports of the archipelago. The ports are the ubiquitous transit prisons, which are geometrically patterned across the map of the motherland. He recounts the tragic story of the Swede Erik Arvid Anderson, sentenced to 20 years for refusing to denounce his native country and his father publicly, showcasing the regime's demands for absolute ideological surrender. Chapter 3. The slave caravans. This describes the use of red cattle cars for direct, rapid transport, often to desolate locations. The preparation of these cars, including barring windows and checking structural strength, emphasized the dehumanization of the perishable goods being moved. Brutal, mass searches were conducted to terrify and dishearten the naked prisoners. Chapter 4. From island to island. This chapter focuses on the movement of individual prisoners. It highlights a key conversation with a young Zek, Boris Gamarov, who challenged Solzhenitsyn's certainty, asking if he was incapable of believing that political leader might sincerely believe in God, forcing the author to question his implanted certainties. Chapter 3. The destructive labor camps. This section investigates the camps themselves, their origins, function, inhabitants, and customs. Chapter 1. The Fingers of Aurora. The concept of forced labor in the archipelago began immediately after the October Revolution. Chapter 2. The archipelago rises from the sea. The system was born on the Solovetsky Island Solovki, where the monastery was repurposed into the northern special purpose camps, characterized by immense cruelty and torture. It introduces the brutal logic of Naftali Frankel: to squeeze everything out of a prisoner in the first 3 months, after that we don't need him anymore. The chapter includes the scandalous visit of Maxim Gorky, who was duped by the elaborate show put on by the administration and wrote glowing praise, while the young boy who told Gorky the truth was immediately shot. Chapter 3. The archipelago metastasizes. Driven by the push for super-industrialization, the archipelago spread, relying on the economic vision proposed by Frankel: socialism built through prisoner labor. This resulted in projects like the White Sea-Baltic Canal Belomorstroi, which was built with wheelbarrow and pick and cost 250,000 corpses, a fact hidden by the official book glorifying the project. Chapter 4. The archipelago hardens. The system solidified, marked by severe discipline, atrocious conditions, and the rampant practice of handing out second camp terms to political prisoners during wartime, often based on fabricated plots created by security officers desperate to prove their own importance and avoid being sent to the front. Chapter 5. What the archipelago stands on. The camp stood on the combination of economic need for cheap, mobile labor and the ideological justification of correction through labor, derived from Marxism. The cruelty was enforced through 3 techniques: the differentiated ration pot starving prisoners into meeting high norms, the brigade relying on prisoner overseers, and 2 sets of bosses conflicting administration and MVD plans designed to flatten the human being. Chapter 6 and 7. They've brought the fascists. The way of life and customs of the natives. the daily life was reduced to exhausting labor, cold, and starvation. It details the extreme suffering from diseases like scurvy and pellagra, emphasizing how chronic hunger dominates all thought, stripping the individual of higher consciousness and reducing them to an animal state. Chapter 8. Women in Camp. Women face severe exploitation, frequently forced to yield to trustees or camp chiefs out of fear of general work. The chapter notes the tragedy of pregnancy in camp and the inevitable separation of mother and child. Chapter 10. In place of politicals, the original political prisoners were replaced by ordinary citizens sentenced under Article 58 for trivial, often nonsensical crimes such as cursing a cow or hanging a cap on a bust of Lenin. Chapter 11. The Loyalists. This critiques imprisoned Orthodox communists, who struggled most painfully because they had to justify their betrayal by their dear party. They swore false loyalty and renounced personal development, paying the price for entrusting their souls to human dogma. Chapter 12. Knock, knock, knock. The system was built on pervasive stool pigeoning, which CheckAGB used not only for information gathering, but to ensure everyone felt perpetually under surveillance. Chapter 16. The Socially Friendly. This describes the thieves Urki, who were celebrated in Soviet literature, but in reality were encouraged by state laws to victimize common citizens and political prisoners, enjoying unbridled power within the camps. Chapter 17. The Kids. The system devoured children from the age of 12 onward, arresting them for petty acts of theft. These juveniles quickly adopted the brutal thieves' philosophy "only might makes right" and became beasts displaying no ethical concepts whatever. Chapter 20. The Dog Service. Solzhenitsyn argues that the camp keepers, guards, and administrators were the product of a negative selection process, ensuring that those who stayed in the system were disproportionately cruel and arrogant. Chapter 21. Campsite. The moral contamination of the camps seeped out into the surrounding free population, creating a campsite mentality that infected the entire country. Chapter 22. We are building. The author contends that despite claims of profitability, the archipelago did not pay its own way, primarily because of the prisoners' deliberate sabotage and the immense superfluous expenditures resulting from the leadership's errors, such as the abandoned Salakar-Digarka railroad. Part 4. The Soul and Barbed Wire. This part shifts from describing the physical reality to exploring the moral and spiritual consequences of imprisonment. Chapter 1. The Ascent. This chapter posits that suffering can lead to a profound spiritual change. Since most prisoners were innocent, their minds turned not to repentance, but to internal wisdom. The great fork in camp life forces choice: survival at any price, losing conscience, or maintaining one's soul risking death. Solzhenitsyn explains his personal ascent, realizing the materialist slogan, "The result is what counts," is a lie. He concludes that true meaning is found not in the result, but in the spirit and the price paid. His realization that the line separating good and evil passes right through every human heart allowed him to forgive his enemies and even bless you, prison, for having been in my life. Chapter 2. Or Corruption. The author acknowledges the counter-arguments, such as Varlam Shalamov's claim that camp only corrupts. However, he maintains that just as oxidation and reduction coexist, there is no corruption without ascent, citing the steadfastness of religious believers who survived uncorrupted because they had a stable moral nucleus, and others who refused to become stoolist despite the threat of death. Chapter 3. Our Muzzled Freedom. This chapter argues that the entire Soviet Union became infected by the archipelago's poisons. The traits of free life were fundamentally defined by the camp mentality: constant fear of arrest, servitude, lack of ability to change jobs or residence, secrecy and mistrust, universal ignorance, lack of information, squealing, betrayal as a form of existence, corruption, and the lie as a form of existence compulsion to affirm the general, common lie. The result was a slave psychology that accepted the grotesque reality of monuments depicting guards setting dogs onto people. Part 5. Katorga. This section focuses on the special camps Katorga, or hard labor, instituted for political prisoners in the post-war years. Chapter 1. The Doomed. The new term katorga was intentionally used to signify the utter, crushing finality of the sentence. This chapter expands the category of enemies to include teachers and former burgomasters who served the occupying Germans, arguing that their choices often stemmed from the Soviet regime's own prior betrayals and cruelty. Chapter 3. Chains. The special camps were characterized by mandatory number patches, bars, and locks, aiming to psychologically crush resistance. Chapter 4. Why did we stand for it? Solzhenitsyn asserts that Zeks eventually stopped submitting. He contrasts the harsh reality of the Gulag with the extraordinarily comfortable banishment experienced by Tsarist-era revolutionaries like Lenin, who traveled freely and received state allowances, illustrating the historical decline of prisoner rights. Chapter 5. Poetry under a tombstone, truth under a stone. The author describes his deliberate choice of hard manual labor in Ekibastus to free his mind for writing. Since paper and pen were forbidden, he composed and memorized 12,000 lines of poetry, using his mind as a hidey hole against the authorities. He met other secret writers like the religious poet Anatoly Silin, who held 20,000 lines in memory. Chapter 6 to 8. The committed escaper The White Kitten, escapes morale and mechanics. These chapters celebrate the committed escapers, such as Georgi Teno, who refused submission. Escapers risked death. If caught, their heads and right arms were sometimes returned for identification. They demonstrated extreme mental discipline and courage, confirming that running away was a necessary expression of freedom, even if unsuccessful. Chapter 9. The kids with Tommy guns, the young convoy guards were indoctrinated to see Zeks as filthy scum, and were rewarded for being quick on the trigger, reinforcing the culture of state-sanctioned murder. Chapter 10 to 12. Behind the wire the ground is burning, tearing at the chains. The 40 Days of Kengir. These chapters document the prisoner rebellions. The resistance began with the realization that collective action was possible, specifically by eliminating stool pigeons, which paralyzed the omnipresent security apparatus. In Ekibastus, the prisoners chose a mass hunger strike, a conscious decision to die together rather than continue to live as slaves. The climax was the 40 Days of Kengir 1954, the largest mutiny where the administration's attempt to use thieves to crush the politicals backfired, leading to an alliance. For 40 days, the Zeks lived as free people within the wire, demanding constitutional rights and justice. The rebellion was ultimately crushed by tanks, killing over 700, but the event marked a turning point, spreading the germ of freedom. Part 6. Exile. This part covers internal exile, the fate of those who survived the camps. Chapter 2. The Peasant Plague. This focuses on the catastrophic dekulakization of 15 million peasants, a second civil war against the rural population. The purpose was not to target bloodsuckers, but to terrify the peasants into becoming serfs on the collective farms, brutally breaking the backbone of Russia. The operation was intended to destroy the peasant seed along with the adults. Chapter 4. Nations in exile. Exile was made immeasurably improved and speeded up by exiling whole nations, categorized as special settlers, an administratively efficient system that swept up everyone, including the unborn. Chapter 5. End of sentence. Solzhenitsyn describes his own arrival in perpetual exile in Kazakhstan, marked by a profound sense of difference from the free population. The morning of March 6, 1953, marked a magnificent augury when he heard the news of Stalin's death. Chapter 7. Zeks at Liberty. Release is characterized as a punishing transition that is often only the space between two arrests. For survivors, life in freedom seems easy, things have been worse. However, the experience of the archipelago makes reunions with families difficult, as the convict and the free relative have changed too radically to reconnect. Part 7. Stalin is no more. The final part addresses the post-Stalin era and the persistence of the archipelago. Chapter 1. Looking back on it all, Solzhenitsyn recounts the impact of his book One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which exposed Stalin's camps. However, he was forced to write this continuation, because contemporary Zeks wrote that nothing has changed in the camps since the publication. Chapter 2. Rulers change, the archipelago remains. Stalin's perfect system collapsed after his death and Beria's fall, leading to temporary leniency, the removal of number patches, and the loosening of restrictions 1954 to 1956. However, Khrushchev, though powerful, frivolously used his opportunities, eventually signing orders in 1956 and 1957 to make the camps harsher again, failing to carry the fight for freedom to conclusion. The author concludes that the archipelago remains because the Soviet political regime could not survive without it. Chapter 3. Below today. Despite official claims that politicals were gone, millions remained, swept in by perverted justice. Solzhenitsyn reveals that the popular protest in Novocherkassk 1962, suppressed violently under Khrushchev, was completely hidden from the populace, showing the continuing fog of universal ignorance. A major, continuous stream of prisoners remains the religious believers labeled religionists, not politicals, persecuted for their faith. He concludes that the persistence of secrecy and injustice means the law today is still non-existent, declaring there is no law. Authors conveyance in sum. Solzhenitsyn's overriding intent is to create a collective monument to those who were tortured and murdered. Ensuring their bitter experience is told so that future generations might learn from it and avoid similar calamities. The work ultimately provides a means of transformation through literary and moral genius, urging readers toward humility and personal responsibility, rather than blaming systemic failures solely on wicked leaders. The book is an impassioned, extended scream of outrage, designed to defeat the lie that sustained the Soviet Empire.